Είναι στα ελληνικά. Την μετάφραση την έχω κάνει εγώ και γι' αυτό είμαι πολύ περήφανο. Επειδή η ελληνική γλώσσα είναι πλούσια και επειδή μπορούμε μέσα από το coaching να επιλέγουμε τις λέξεις. Παραδείγματος χάρη, το βασικό θέμα είναι mindful compassionate, δηλαδή ενσυνειδητότητα, αυτό έχει καθιερωθεί πλέον. Το compassion, συχνά τα πούμε σαν συμπόνια, είναι κάτι που έχει μια αρνητική χρειά. Η ελληνική γλώσσα είναι πολύ πιο πλούσια και μπορούμε να επιλέξουμε την εσπλαχνία, η οποία έχει μια θετική πλαισίωση. Οπότε με αυτήν την έννοια μπορούμε να we can start the presentation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. It's a real honour. I'm very excited to be here with you. I'm very grateful to be invited by Astalos. Now, because mindfulness is experiential, we have to actually experience it, and because we know it helps us get more present and to focus, I thought it would be a good thing to start with a very short practice.
Μεταφράσω με αυτό. Λύζεται ότι επειδή το mindfulness, η συνειδητότητα είναι κάτι το οποίο μας βοηθάει στο να επικεντρωνόμαστε, να πληρώνουμε την προσοχή μας, αλλά είναι και να είμαστε πιο αυθεντικά παρόντες στη στιγμή. Επίσης είναι εξαιρετικά βιωματικό. Γι' αυτό σκέφτηκε η Λίζ να ξεκινήσουμε με μια μικρή πρακτική ενσυνειδητότητας.
So I invite you all to join in this practice if you feel okay to do that. So getting comfortable in your chair with your legs uncrossed, your feet flat on the floor, your hands resting on your lap, and sitting in a noble position. So imagining maybe a piece of string pulling you up from the crown of your head. And closing your eyes, if that feels okay.
Okay, so αυτό που θέλουμε είναι να χαλαρώσετε πάνω στο καθισμά σας, να ανέσετε τα πρώτα πόδια να τα ανοίξετε, να πατήσετε στερεά, να αισθανθείτε το έδαφος κάτω από τα πέλματά σας, να βάλετε χαλαρά τα χέρια σας πάνω στα γόνατά σας ή στα πόδια σας και να κρατήσετε μια κάθετη στάση, η οποία να είναι βολική, αλλά να είναι όσο γίνεται πιο ευθυτενής και να αισθανθείτε σαν να υπήρχε ένα σύρμα το οποίο να σας συνέδεε από την σπονδυλική στήλη μέχρι τον ουρανό.
So, taking 3 deep breaths and on each out breath, letting go.
Okay. Πάρετε 3 βαθιές αναπνοές και σε κάθε εκπνοή αφήστε από μέσα σας να φύγει ό,τι είναι αυτό που θα θέλετε να φύγει.
And then carrying on breathing normally and just paying attention to how that breathing feels in your bodies.
Συνεχίστε να αναπνέετε κανονικά και δώστε την προσοχή σας στο τι είναι αυτό που ακριβώς συμβαίνει αυτή τη στιγμή στο σώμα σας.
Having a real sense of arriving in the room.
Και αποκτάτε μία πραγματική αίσθηση του σαν να φτάνετε να έρχεστε μέσα στον χώρο στον οποίο.
And then tuning into your intention for the rest of this celebratory event. What's going on for you right now?
Και συντονιστείτε στην πρόθεση που έχετε γύρω από αυτή την ομιλία και από το υπόλοιπο αυτού της εορταστικής εκδήλωσης.
And then gently coming back to the room, opening your eyes if you close them, maybe you're having a stretch, a smile.
Έρχεστε σιγά σιγά ξανά πίσω, ανοίξτε τα μάτια σας αν τα είχατε κλείσει, αρχίζετε να χαλαρώσετε, ίσως θέλετε να πετυχείτε, να χαμογελάσετε.
You speak such brilliant Greek, it's amazing. Okay, so I just very briefly a little bit about my story, about how I came to mindfulness. So 24 years ago, more or less, a little bit less, my eldest daughter was a tiny baby, and I was a very busy journalist, really stressed. I was a single mother, and I wasn't really coping. And a friend of mine shared some techniques that I didn't actually know were mindfulness, but they were. Basically about how I could actually carry on doing everything I was doing, but being more in the present moment. Now, we know these days that that's mindfulness, but back then, not many people were talking about it. And it was amazing. I could suddenly breathe, survive, and more importantly, I felt I was really present with my daughter. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about doing the washing, doing my work, the future, basically. So that sort of got me very excited about mindfulness, and I've been practicing for many, many years. But for a very long time, I was a closet meditator. I didn't tell anybody in the business world. I was coaching, I was writing about business, but it was a secret that I did this meditation. And I know some of you have had similar experiences. But I began to feel more brave about sharing mindfulness in my coaching, because I thought if it's benefited me so much, it's bound to benefit my clients. But when I looked around, there wasn't much in the literature, which is why I was prompted to do the research in my first book and so on. And of course nowadays mindfulness is everywhere, which is brilliant. So in this talk I'm going to draw on some themes from my research in the two books and ongoing, basically around how we can partner up with individuals and organisations to move through challenging times, drawing on mindfulness and compassion. So I don't know if you've heard of the saying, relax, everything's under control. Well, there's a Zen saying, which is relax, nothing's under control. And I don't know about you, and it may not actually be true, but certainly I think that's the sense that a lot of us have, that, today's the anniversary of 9/11, isn't it? Crisis it seems to be everywhere, challenge is everywhere. It certainly feels that way anyway. And there was an article in Harvard Business Review by Bennett and Lemoine which talked about VUCA, which basically stands for volatile, unpredictable, complex and ambiguous. And basically the idea is that in management circles we use the term VUCA to say it's crazy out there. And we're always saying it's crazy out there. So how are we going to work with this? Now, when I was doing research for the second book, I was curious about how this crisis, these challenges, could actually help if there would be no lotus without mud. And I might say more about that later. So mindfulness and compassion, I know at least some of you have a mindfulness practice, you do meditation, so you will know about this. But just for those of you who don't, what is mindfulness and compassion? One definition by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's been very instrumental in bringing mindfulness into the mainstream. Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, with non-judgment. Okay? So we can think of it really as a way of training our mind, of a way of being, a different way of being, and a set of values. Compassion. One definition from the Dalai Lama, no less, but who's been quoted, this very definition has now been appearing in lots of the literature, psychology literature and everything, is a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others, which with deep commitment to relieve that. So there's this idea that there's an action. So we don't just empathise, we take action. So what does it look like, mindful, compassionate coaching? So I've loosely called this the 10 commitments, thinking of the 10 commandments, but it's actually a collection of aspirations, values, behaviours. So just to go through those quickly, one thing I think is really important is to practice developing mindfulness and compassion regularly. Now, some of the research is showing that as little as 10 minutes a day can make all the difference. This is from the Ashridge Business School. So I think it doesn't have to go into a cave for 3 months. You can just do 5-10 minutes, and we're all busy, so this is quite exciting to realise that we can get away with that. But basically regular practice. Do some training. Now I know in Athens there's an 8-week program in mindfulness you can go off and do, and there will be all sorts of other training, but just get some input around that. And then these aspirations, basically non-judgment, compassion, being really curious. Being willing to stay with not knowing, which is really important these days when we can't have all the answers. You know, we expect our leaders to have all the answers. There's something really wonderful about actually being not knowing. Accepting what's happening, what's emerging, without trying to change it always. Working with difficulty and not being overly attached to outcomes. And the other piece for me, which I think is really important, is before each coaching session, prepare mindfully. In the coaching session, if the client has said something that's got you all agitated, you can practice mindfulness in the session. Take a systemic perspective. Now we know that mindfulness helps us be interconnected, so there's this idea that we get more data, we can work with the system. Okay? Reflecting mindfully after each session, seeking some supervision that has a mindful flavour to it. It can be short or mindful. And really importantly, taking time out ourselves to recharge. It could be going to the beach or a walk or whatever it is. So there's a value for me in combining, having mindfulness grounded in bodily wisdom and compassion. That works very well in English because it's ABC, but it won't be the same in Greek. But this idea that the mindfulness has to also draw on the bodily wisdom. So in the West, we're very good at cutting off hair, aren't we? Everything's in our heads. But with mindfulness, we learn how to work with the body to get more information, to get more wisdom. And actually, you know, we can work with that to be more well-informed. And for me, there's a real sense that mindfulness and compassion go well together. They're two sides of the same coin. So, for example, a sniper in the war can be very mindful, really targeted, and very good at shooting, but they're probably not practicing, maybe they are, compassion. And compassion on its own, we could say, is to be self-pity. We need to be mindful. You've all come today, you could have said, no, I'm too tired, it's my first week back at work, I can't be bothered. That could be compassion, but if we've got the mindfulness, the awareness, then it's balanced, isn't it? So thinking back to the lotus we were talking about, we're not just focusing on the mud, we're looking at nurturing the lotus flower that opens out in the world. So it's all of those elements. So very important, obviously, in challenging times is the idea of well-being. There's so much research out there about how mindfulness and increasingly compassion can help us become more mentally and physically well, really key in coaching. And we're seeing a rise in mental health problems all over the world. And I think it's no longer okay as coaches to say, oh, I don't do problems like that, I only do good stuff. Go away, you know, because all of our clients, ourselves included, all of us are having some stress. It's not easy. So I think we have to have some ways to work with that. And of course we have to recognise boundaries, refer on to therapists if need be. But we can do some work initially. We know that mindfulness helps us, improves our ability to manage stress, and it's actually shown to reduce the number of sick days taken. So it's really, really key in challenging times. As I say, more and more we're seeing research on compassion. Compassion helps people, the research is showing, feel seen, feel heard. It's boosting trust, it's boosting well-being. And we're seeing a lot more organisations recognising that. Okay. Boyatzis, Smith and Beveridge have done some work where they showed that if you use compassion in coaching, it actually helps not only boost health and well-being, but it brings more change, it helps us get the change in place. And of course, self-care of the coach. We can't look after other people, we can't work with other people unless we're looking after ourselves. So in addition to sharing techniques with clients for well-being, we need to go and do the self-care piece. So just briefly, I worked with a housing association in London which helps people find houses in London. So it's a very stressful job. The frontline people were in a terrible state, performance had plummeted, and we offered a combination of coaching with mindfulness training, conflict mediation. And as you can see there were great improvements in stress management, communication and relationships, workload and working practices, and work-life balance. And there's more case studies coming through about the impact of mindfulness. So, I'm going to end up learning Greek, you know. Attending to relationships. There's a project which some of you will have heard of, carried out by Google over 2 years, Project Aristotle. Aristoteles, I think we will say it here, which showed that the most important thing in high-performing teams was psychological safety. So we're talking about things like trust. And we know from the research that mindfulness and compassion is brilliant at boosting trust and psychological safety. So it makes sense to me for all of us working in organisations, particularly in challenging times, that we bring some mindfulness and compassion in to actually bring about change in this area. So we've seen increased collaboration, psychological safety, connectivity, ethics, ethical values, etc. And as I said before, more and more research coming through on the impact of compassion. Now, I don't know about here in the East, but compassion in organisations, sometimes there's a bit of resistance, but actually it's being shown to have a real impact in terms of relationships. Rothie Park have developed a compassionate work index, so you can actually measure individuals and the organisation's levels of compassion. And one thing to say is we're not talking about soft love, we're talking about tough love. Muscular compassion is what the Dalai Lama calls it. So we can still be compassionate but set boundaries, and I think that's really important. So a lot of organisations don't want to talk about emotions, and even some clients or even some coaches don't want to talk about emotions, but emotions are so important in times of change. But anyway, and I think what we see is that if organisations ignore emotions, there's a real danger that they're inhibiting progress, culture change, all the rest of it. So in times of transition, emotions are often buried under the carpet. But we know that mindfulness can help us work with emotions, fostering sort of what we might call connection emotions. So very important with the endings is working with emotions, so not ignoring loss. So if an organisation is going through a time of transition, transformation, crisis, whatever word they're using, you have to support the people going through this transition. You have to talk about the loss of role, the loss of whatever's going on for them. Otherwise, it won't work. It will all come crashing down. And mindfulness is really useful here because it can support this process. The neutral zone, the emotion can be seen as emotional wilderness, so it's not neutral at all, it's actually can be quite hellish, and it's where all the realignment takes place. Very important to support people at that stage, because that's when organisations will lose a lot of people. Okay. And they'll stop it working, whatever process is happening. And obviously in New Beginnings, it's about working around the story. And again, we want to create a safe space in which this can happen, drawing on mindfulness and compassion. So I've been talking a bit about turning towards the mud, if you think of the lotus flower, and it is important in these difficult times, extremely important. But I wanted to say also that mindfulness is brilliant in terms of boosting performance. Now, I know I didn't understand most of it, but Angelos, you talked about how cognitive flexibility is becoming more important, the World Economic Forum. So mindfulness, so much research about how mindfulness helps us perform better, helps us think more flexibly, make quicker decisions, more rational, more strategic thinking. Access to more data. If we're tuning into what's going on into our body, or we're getting used to being aware, then we get more information from ourselves, from the room around us, from the system. So we're bound to be better able to perform. Now, we could go into overwhelm, but because we get these strategies from mindfulness, we can process, we can manage ourselves, we can manage our relationships with others. Also associated with creativity and innovation. Now, in times of difficult times, that always goes down because people get tunnel vision. It's all about risk. You know, if we're bringing in mindfulness, then we're enabling this environment in which we can still be creative, we can be flexible, we can be adaptive. It increases our working memory capacity. So if we think of a computer, it just means we've got more space on the computer, which again goes out the window when it's a challenging time. So those are reasons why, as coaches, particularly in challenging times, we should be drawing on mindfulness and compassion. Okay, sorry, I've got a lovely lady, look for her, so it's helping with time. Another thing to say is as I mentioned earlier, about mindfulness helping us attend to the system. And I think it's increasingly what we see in our coaching work, that we don't just deal with the individual, we try and take into account the system. Now, back in I forget when, I wasn't around at that time, but back in the days when we had mining in the UK, the miners would go into the mine with a canary, those little yellow birds in a cage. And if the canary started looking a bit wobbly or died, it was time to get out of the mine, because it would show that it would be a sign that there were toxic gases. And so we often see this in our coaching, that we'll be dealing with an individual when it's difficult times in their organisation. And the individual is like a sign of what's going on elsewhere in the organisation. And it's really important, because a lot of the time the organisation will say, oh, that's just Joe, he's useless, he used to be good, but you know what, he's terrible these days, he just can't do it anymore. But as coaches, we need to be alert to that. We need to create that space, a mindful, compassionate space where we can support that individual who's going through a really difficult time, but also feed back in a mindful, compassionate way to the organisations to say, look, Joe is actually a sign of what's happening. The other thing I think is that sometimes we have to work with what the client is not telling us. So if we're, as a coach, using mindfulness and compassion to be a better instrument, using ourselves as an instrument, then we'll be picking up much more of what they're not saying, i.e. what else is going on in the system. When things fall apart, it's like a school playground, isn't it? Primitive dynamics. We're all back to being, all of our different roles back in the day at school, which is really can be quite messy, quite ugly. So really important to have self-care for us as a coach, to be able to support the client, the wider organisation with compassion. Because actually we do need to pull them up. We have to have tough love, that muscular compassion you talked about. Can't let them get away with that. And again, in terms of the system, mindfulness helps us. We have the aspiration, and it does help us be more curious, be more open to possibilities, more comfortable with ambiguity and not knowing. So we're just going to be like, there's a window of possibilities, which is what we want in terms of helping the system, the organisation survive and thrive. Just a couple of last things. When we have challenging times, we feel more vulnerable, don't we? And we often think of vulnerability as a weakness. And I know on the reading material, one of the books is Brené Brown. I'm really glad, because she's my heroine, one of them. So I just wanted to say something about that. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's about the willingness to show up and be seen when you can't control the outcome. It's our greatest measure of courage, the birthplace of creativity, innovation and change. So it helps us, it's good for us to be in touch with vulnerability. And mindfulness and self-compassion enable us to be better in touch with vulnerability. And one last thing, I'm hoping that the employers, the organisations that are represented here today will agree that it's not all about productivity, performance, all the rest of it. It's actually about bringing back the joy, I think. Being happy. We're allowed to be happy at work as well. It's been shown to boost performance anyway. But I think for me, the greatest gift I've got from mindfulness and compassion is that I feel so much happier than I ever did before. So that's where I've got to. I wanted to take a few questions. We have time for a few questions. Firstly, just wanted to say about some next steps, just to mention very briefly. I'm very excited to be working with Angelos. We have a mindfulness and compassion at work program that you'll hear about, and hopefully an event as well. So just to mention that really in passing. So thank you all for listening, and open to some questions.
Θα ήθελε κάποιος να κάνει μια ερώτηση, μέχρι να το σκεφτείτε. I'd like to say a big thank you. And I cannot really express how grateful I am for this moment. Και το ότι η Λύση Χολ δέχτηκε να έρθει στην Ελλάδα να μιλήσει. Ήρθε μόνο για εμάς. She came here just for us, only for us, exclusively, which is great. She's such a great person and an important figure and researcher in a great she produces this great wisdom around coaching, mindfulness and compassion with her work and her books. And I was telling her that when I read her first book, όταν διάβασα το πρώτο βιβλίο του για το mindful coaching, ότι τη διάβασα ένα καλοκαίρι στην παραλία και έχασα αρκετά μπάνια γιατί με είχε τόσο πολύ μαγεύσει το βιβλίο αυτό το ίδιο. Και ξέρετε εσείς οι νεότεροι σπουδαστές ότι πλέον έχουμε βάλει στα προγράμματα της Positivity ότι ενότητα που έχει να κάνει με την συνειδητότητα, με το mindfulness, γιατί είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικό. Βέβαια, αυτά που έχετε και προσθέτει οι Λύες πραγματικά είναι εξαιρετικά και προλάβαμε να τα χωρέσουμε. You managed to include almost everything in only 30 minutes. Ποιος θα ήθελε να κάνει κάποια ερώτηση? Ναι, ελάτε.
Liz, you talked before about compassion and boundaries. I know it's a thin line between this. Could you please elaborate a little bit more?
Okay, so do you mean when people are having a difficult time having boundaries, or can you explain a bit more what you'd like to know, please?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So I think it's really important to work out how we can be kind to ourselves and others, but also not drift into self-pity. So I think that's why for me it's really important to have mindfulness in there as well. Because when we practice mindfulness, we become really aware of what's going on for ourselves, and that can be really, really tough. Because it's not nice in there, it's quite ugly really. I don't know about you, but when I look inside I'm like, ugh! So we have to have that kindness, that compassion, to help us work with what's there, okay? And I think unless we do that for ourselves, it's really difficult for then us to work with other individuals. Okay? And when I first started teaching mindfulness to coaches, I used compassion a lot. I did some little exercises which are about being, one is called the loving kindness meditation. So it's around being compassionate to yourselves and others. And at first it was fine, and then I got to a point where some coaches were saying, oh, I really can't do this is so difficult to be compassionate to myself. So I think that's one key area. We have to learn. It's not easy. We have to learn how to be compassionate to ourselves. Some people think of it as an advanced practice, but I think we can start by just being kind. So that's one thing. I think that kind of combination, learning to do it ourselves. And in terms of boundaries, in terms of referring on, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. In the past, people used to say, okay, I'm a coach, I work with people in organisations, I don't touch the difficult stuff because that's for therapists. And I really mean it when I say I don't think that's tenable anymore. I think that's mad because everyone who comes through the door is struggling in some way, I find. So they may not talk about it in the first session, but by session 4 they probably will say, look, I'm finding it a bit tough, you know? So if we haven't got our own practice, we can't go where they've gone. So we coach from our wounds in a way, you know? And I think there is plenty we can do to support people who haven't got a pathology, but who are struggling and still maintaining boundary. So I think, yeah, there are lots of, but mindfulness is used to support people who've got depression and anxiety. You know, there's a lot out there, but it's tricky. As I say, I don't think we can say no anymore. Does that answer a bit?
Yeah.
Or? Yeah, it's, I could talk for hours about that.
Can I add something? Can you perhaps describe what is how is compassion leading to action?
Yeah.
Should that
So it's an aspiration. The words in, written, it doesn't matter, this is in Greek. Okay, so the source of the word compassion is comparti, to suffer with somebody, okay? But it's always in the literature been associated with taking action to alleviate it. So it's actually an aspiration, really. Because if we truly feel compassionate towards somebody, then we really should be moved to do something about it. Otherwise, it's not real. So, and it's really important. So that this is the thing. It's got to be connected with taking some action. You know. So I think increasingly we're seeing that being spelled out. Yeah. And what that looks like, well, I don't know. It could look like anything. Whatever steps need to happen. or even a shift. I mean, sometimes I work with clients and we explore them changing their relationship with people. We do some compassionate work. They've got a problem with a colleague or a boss, and they have all these actions they've identified, which they're going to go off and say this and talk about this in a mindful, compassionate way. But then they don't need to. They go back and they say, wow, something's shifted, it's magic. Even the intention has shifted something, which sounds a bit spooky, I know, and a bit weird, but it happens so many times. They go back and the relationship's already shifted. So action in all sorts of magical ways.
Κάποια άλλη ερώτηση?
You said before that if it's not pathology, then we might have. However, how can we define what pathology is not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably the derivation between two perspectives.
Okay, so you have to look out for a lot of red flags. There are red flags, and in the second book, I've got a whole chapter. I didn't write it, but I got someone to write it about what exactly to look out for. And I think we should be getting equipped with that. So, I mean, for example, if someone's talking about suicide, if they're talking about child abuse themselves, being abused as a child. If they've got severe addiction, so not just someone saying, oh, I'm really stressed, I'm drinking more, I'm smoking more, I'm eating more, but someone who's actually sharing how their addiction has got out completely out of hand. They've got really terrible physical symptoms as well. You have to feel your way into it, I think. But there are some clear red flags to look out for.
So do you think it can be effective to have a parallel way for coaching and, let's say, person that is under therapy?
So do I think it's, can you repeat,
It can be
sorry?
effective to have a parallel relation, to have a person under therapy and under coaching.
Well, there's lots of different schools of thought on that. What I would say is I think for those of us who are coaches and therapists, we have to have a very clear contract. So we can't start with coaching and then say, hey, I think you need therapy. Here I am. Absolutely bad. I can't do that. But there are cases where people have started coaching and they've continued to work with the coach. I've had this, they've continued to work with the coach, but they've also gone to have therapy. Other people will say, no, just work with one person. So, it does depend a bit, but I think the main thing, the most important thing is to have some strategies for dealing with somebody who the client who presents is having a bit of a tough time, and to know when to refer on. And if we're not sure, then you refer on. Don't risk anything. Hippocrates. Don't do harm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eva?
I'd like to ask you a question regarding what was happening in the world and in this field, let's say, a few years back, where industry and business was production, and there was a lot of wellness programs. What do you think? And then there was a pause for about 20 years. Now the coaching boom, the mindfulness boom, all this that's going on. Why do you think that that's now so?
That's a good question, and I do remember we employee assistance programs of wellness, and it's such a big thing. And then we forgot all about it, and then we all started falling apart. That's one thing.
A lot of money spent.
A lot of money spent. So I'm laughing, but I think there is an increase in mental health issues. So I interviewed a lot of people for the second book, KPMG, all sorts of companies, banks, all the rest of it. And they were saying that actually, some off the record, some on the record, saying that their staff are really struggling. So there's this idea that from organisations that they want to have an antidote, some kind of way of supporting them. So there's been a rise, I would say,
because
in
of
issues.
an increase in stress in the workplace?
Yeah, because of the increase in stress in the workplace, for lots of reasons, being available 24/7, etc., chaos, climate change, whatever. It's
Information, the whole...
Yeah, I mean, you could say it's, we perceive it differently, but it seems to be, sorry. And also the research is showing the benefits, so that's where everyone's interested.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
We had to wrap it up.
Thank you.